The shore near Hong Kong's legislature has been a hotspot of the anti-government protests. Daniel Chan has spent a lot of time here, but that could change soon. Daniel, not his real name, was arrested and charged with rioting in July. He faces up to 10 years behind bars.
The moment I was arrested, I was very calm. I was thinking about what I needed to do in the situation. But when I was told what the charges were, it felt like I was entering another world.
Hong Kong has some of the most draconian assembly laws in the world. Some of them have rarely been applied until now. But since the protests began, authorities have brought the full force of these laws to bear. Daniel denies having been involved in any violence.
I'm too much of a coward to get into fighting. I don't want to be beaten, but I also don't want to stand there and do nothing. So I went to the front line to help those who were tear-gassed, and I helped them wash their eyes out with saline solution.
43 others were arrested the day Daniel was detained. All have been charged with rioting, the most severe offense on the books. It is the most people facing such charges since Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997. The British government established the laws to quell anti-colonial unrest, but they remained in place after the handover. Dennis Kwok, a lawmaker who represents the legal professions in the legislature, says charges are politically motivated.
If one is to look at these cases impartially, I'm sure you would find that a lot of these charges are not supported by evidence, and they were made-up charges and done to scare people, hoping that they would be deterred from going out.
In a statement to DW, the Department of Justice denies political considerations. It insists prosecutors would act fairly and impartially. Daniel Chan is not convinced.
I try not to think too much about the possibility that I might go to prison for the next decade. I would rather focus on what I can do to support the movement. To worry about the sentence will just demoralize me.
His trial is scheduled for the end of this month, but whatever the outcome might be, the government's strategy has already had an impact. Since July, Daniel hasn't taken part in any more protests.
DW correspondent Matthias Berlinger is standing by for us in Hong Kong. Matthias, are would-be protesters now thinking twice about taking to the streets, knowing that they too could face serious charges like Daniel Chan?
Well, the interesting thing is that all these strategies of deterrence, be it these charges, these harsh charges against the protesters, be it the threat to invade with the military police from China, all these strategies of deterrence have not worked in Hong Kong. Of course, many Hong Kongers do not dare to go to these unauthorized protests for fear of being arrested or having trouble, but there's still a huge number of people who go and who know that they face a lot of trouble, but who still go. So deterrence is definitely not a strategy to end these protests.
What are the prospects, Matthias, that Daniel Chan and others will actually have to stand trial? And if they do, can they expect a fair trial?
Well, the courts in Hong Kong are still, the judges are still pretty independent. The prosecution is under the Department of Justice, so a political abuse of the prosecution is much more likely than of the judges. Whether they can be convicted of rioting stands at question here, because the courts or the prosecution would need to prove that they had an intention to use violence, and this is something that many experts here think is not easy to prove, and we might not see all of these people convicted. However, of course, once the procedure is in court, there is a risk of being convicted, and this is obviously what was intended.
Since the controversial extradition law was withdrawn, the protesters have focused on their demands for democratic reforms in Hong Kong. Do they have any prospects of actually pushing those demands through against the will of mainland China?
the interesting thing is that almost no protester thinks that they have a chance to push any of their demands, or maybe at least to push like political reform through. This is something that is very unlikely, and the reason why the protesters continue to protest is because there is a fear that once they stop, there would be a revenge. Beijing would take its revenge. More people would be charged. So the protest basically is, the protesters keep taking to the streets in order not to show weakness and to keep this going on, hoping that there will not be a backlash, but with little hope that they can achieve their demands.
Matthias, thank you very much for filling us in. Matthias Böllinger there in Hong Kong.